They drove 250,000 cattle across 1,500 miles of dust, drought, and death. And nobody ever told you what they actually ate. Not the Hollywood version, the real version. A chemical reaction between campfire ash and cornmeal that unlocks nutrients the human body cannot access any other way. A stew made from a body part so strange that trail cooks gave it a name too vulgar to print. And the number one meal, something modern Manhattan steakhouses charge $50 a plate for, that cowboys stumbled into purely because they didn't have a clean pan. This is the food history they buried under cowboy movies and barbecue myths. These 25 meals are what actually kept the American West alive. 25. Hardtack soaked in bacon grease. Before the chuck wagon had anything fancy, cowboys carried hardtack, dense, square crackers baked from nothing but flour and water. Civil War soldiers called them sheet iron and worm castles. A single cracker could survive months in a saddlebag without spoiling. The problem was getting it into your mouth. Hardtack was so hard it could chip a tooth. Cowboys soaked it in hot bacon grease, crumbled it into black coffee, or fried the soaked pieces until the edges crisped into something almost edible. A full barrel cost about $2 in the 1870s and fed a crew for weeks. It tasted like absolutely nothing, and that was the entire point. Pure survival fuel for men 80 miles from the nearest town. 24. Cowboy beans. Pinto beans were the backbone of every cattle drive. Dried pintos traveled light, lasted forever, and delivered the protein that kept a man upright through 16-hour days in the saddle. The cook soaked them overnight, then simmered them for hours in a cast-iron Dutch oven buried in coals. Salt pork went in for fat, wild onions if he'd foraged any, a fistful of dried chili peppers if the outfit ran a South Texas crew. By evening, those beans turned into a thick, smoky paste that clung to a tin plate and stayed in your belly through the long night watch. A 50-pound sack cost about $4 in the 1870s and stretched across an entire drive. Cowboys ate beans at breakfast, beans at supper, beans cold from the pot at midnight when they came off watch. They complained about the consequences loudly and never once turned down a second helping. 23. Jerky. Long before gas stations and teriyaki glaze, jerky was the original trail food. Cowboys cut lean beef into thin strips, rubbed them with salt, and hung them over low smoke or draped them across wagon frames to dry in the Texas sun. Trail jerky was nothing like what you buy today. It was drier, more brittle, and so salty it cracked your lips. Cowboys chewed it like tobacco, working a single strip for 20 minutes just to soften it enough to swallow. The smart ones crumbled it into stews or soaked strips in water to rehydrate the meat. Native peoples had perfected this technique centuries before cowboys adopted it. A week's worth of protein fit in a coat pocket. No fire needed, no preparation required. 22. Sourdough biscuits. The sourdough starter was the single most valuable thing in the chuck wagon. A good starter was a living culture of wild yeast, kept alive in a clay crock, fed with flour and water, and sometimes carried for years from one drive to the next. Every morning before dawn, the cook mixed starter with flour, salt, and lard, then baked biscuits in a Dutch oven with coals heaped on the lid. They came out steaming, golden, and heavy enough to anchor a hat in a windstorm. Some cooks were so protective of their starters, they slept with the crock pressed against their body on cold nights to keep the yeast alive. Lose the starter, and you lost the one thing that made trail food bearable.
Fried salt pork. When beef was off limits because you do not eat the product you're being paid to deliver, salt pork carried the crew. Thick slabs of pork belly, cured in heavy brine and packed in wooden barrels. The cook sliced it thin, soaked the slices in water to pull out some of the salt, then fried them until the fat rendered and the edges crisped. The leftover grease became the foundation of everything else made that day. Cowboys called it sow belly. A barrel ran about $8 and lasted weeks. On a frozen morning in the Texas Panhandle, with frost on the grass and 1,000 longhorns stirring in the dark, That sizzle in the skillet was the sound of another day survived. 20. Cornmeal mush. When flour ran low, the cook turned to cornmeal. A few cups stirred into boiling water, a pinch of salt. That produced a thick porridge that could be eaten hot or poured into a pan to set overnight. The next morning, the cook sliced the solidified mush and fried the pieces in bacon grease until a golden crust formed, crispy outside, soft and warm in the middle. A 25-pound bag cost about $1 and traveled in any weather. Trail cooks from the deep south brought this tradition with them from home. It required nothing but water, fire, and a heavy pan, the simplest meal on the trail, and one of the most satisfying. Pattern break. The cook. Here's something Westerns never told you. The cook earned more money than the cowboys, around $45 a month compared to $25 or $30 for the men working cattle. He woke at 3 in the morning, ground the coffee, started the fire, had breakfast ready before the first man rolled out of his bedroll. He then packed the entire wagon, drove ahead of the herd, set up again, and started cooking supper. He was also the camp barber, the dentist, the letter writer, and the closest thing to a doctor for 100 miles. If a cowboy disrespected the cook, he didn't eat. Every man on that drive knew the truth. A bad cook could break an outfit faster than a stampede. 18. Red-eye gravy. When a cowboy wanted something to drown his biscuits in, red-eye gravy was the answer. The cook fried salt pork in a skillet, then poured black coffee directly into the hot pan drippings. The mixture hissed and pulled up all those stuck-on bits of caramelized meat, creating a thin, dark gravy with a bitter edge and a deep pork flavor. No flour, no milk, just grease and coffee. The name came from the reddish sheen that floated on top when fat and coffee separated. Cowboys poured it over biscuits, over mush, over anything that needed moisture. Red-eye gravy cost nothing extra. It was efficiency itself, born from a culture that couldn't afford to waste a single drop of anything. 18. Son of a gun stew. This is the one with the unprintable name. When a calf was slaughtered on the trail, the cook used everything: heart, liver, tongue, sweetbreads, kidneys, and the key ingredient, a tube connecting two of the calf's stomachs called the marrow gut. Found only in unweaned calves still feeding on milk, this tube was filled with a substance resembling bone marrow that gave the stew its legendary richness. The cook diced everything, browned it in a Dutch oven, added wild onions and water, and simmered for hours. Old trail hands said you could judge a cook entirely by his son-of-a-gun stew. Too much liver, it turned bitter. Not enough marrow gut, it lost its soul. Dutch oven peach cobbler. On special nights, maybe after crossing a river without losing any cattle, the cook broke out the dried peaches. He soaked them until they plumped back to life, sweetened them with brown sugar and a splash of whatever whiskey someone was willing to sacrifice. Those peaches went into a Dutch oven lined with biscuit dough, and coals were placed underneath and on the lid. 40 minutes later, the camp smelled like a bakery. The biscuit crust puffed golden and flaky. The peaches bubbled thick and syrupy beneath it, and grown men who'd spent the day choking on dust went dead silent at the first bite. A good cook knew the truth. Morale mattered as much as calories. One cobbler could keep a crew happy for a week. Spotted pup. Cowboys had their own version of rice pudding. The cook simmered rice until tender, then stirred in raisins or dried currants, brown sugar, and a splash of canned milk when the wagon carried any. The raisins scattered through the pale rice gave the dish its name. It looked like a spotted dog. Cowboys who'd spent every meal eating beans and salt pork treated spotted pup like a reward. It was sweet, soft, and reminded them of something their mothers might have made it back home in Missouri or Tennessee. Bear sign. The fastest way for a trail cook to become a legend was to make bear sign. These were donuts fried in deep rendered lard over an open fire. The cook mixed flour, sugar, and sourdough starter into a soft dough, cut it into rings, and dropped them into a Dutch oven filled with shimmering hot fat. They puffed up golden and crisp in minutes. Rolled in sugar while still warm, bear sign disappeared from the plate before the cook could finish frying the next batch. A cook who could make bear sign had his pick outfits. Cowboys would ride extra miles and work longer shifts for a man who fried donuts on Saturday nights. Skillet cornbread. Cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet over campfire coals was the other daily bread of the cattle drive. The cook mixed cornmeal, a little flour, salt, baking soda, and water, poured the batter into a greased skillet, and nestled it into the coals with the lid on. The bottom formed a thick, crunchy crust. The inside stayed moist and crumbly. The whole thing slid out in one golden disc that the cook cut into wedges with a knife. Cowboys crumbled it into beans, dragged it through gravy, or ate it plain with a drizzle of sorghum syrup. The sound of cornbread sizzling in a hot skillet meant supper was close. On a trail drive, that was the best news a man could hear. Vinegar pie. When the chuck wagon had no fruit, nothing sweet but sugar and a jug of apple cider, the cook made vinegar pie. It sounds terrible. It was anything but. Vinegar mixed with sugar, eggs, butter, and nutmeg created a filling that tasted remarkably like lemon custard. Poured into a pastry shell and baked in the Dutch oven, it emerged golden and trembling. This recipe came from Appalachian kitchens where lemons were impossible to find. Cowboys who tasted it for the first time demanded to know where the cook found lemons on the open prairie. The answer got a laugh every time. Pattern break, the chuck wagon. The chuck wagon itself was an engineering marvel. Charles Goodnight's 1866 design featured a hinged tailgate that dropped down to form a work table. Shelves and drawers held every supply within arm's reach. A water barrel strapped to the side. Underneath, a rawhide sling called the possum belly carried firewood and dried buffalo chips for fuel. The entire rig carried enough food for 15 cowboys for 2 months. A fully stocked chuck wagon cost about $75 to outfit. Modern food trucks run north of $50,000. Goodnight's design worked so well it stayed essentially unchanged for 40 years. Pemmican. Cowboys borrowed this directly from native peoples who had been making it for centuries. Dried meat, usually buffalo or venison, pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, then pressed into dense cakes that could last for years. A single pound packed around 3,500 calories, enough to fuel a working man for an entire day. Cowboys carried it in saddlebags for emergencies, gnawing off chunks when they were too far from the wagon for a proper meal. It wasn't something you ate for pleasure. It was something you ate because the nearest campfire was 6 hours behind you, and the herd was not going to stop. Fried prairie chicken. When a cowboy got lucky with a rifle, prairie chicken was the prize. These plump birds were abundant across the Great Plains, and a good shot could bring down enough to feed half the crew. The cook plucked them, dredged the pieces in flour with salt and pepper, and fried them in deep lard. Prairie chicken fried up golden and crispy outside, juicy and tender within. The flavor was gamier than domestic chicken, richer, with a hint of the wild grasses the birds fed on. These birds were eventually so overhunted their numbers crashed by the early 1900s, taking this trail meal with them into extinction.
Bacon and bean one-pot stew. The most common supper on the trail was also the simplest. Beans simmered all day in the Dutch oven. Bacon or salt pork went in early for fat and flavor. Wild onions, a dried chili, maybe cornmeal stirred in near the end for thickening. One pot, one fire, one meal for 15 men. The cook started this in the morning and let it simmer while the outfit moved. By evening, the beans had absorbed every drop of pork flavor and turned thick enough to stand a spoon in. Cowboys ate it from tin plates, sitting on their saddles around the fire, too tired to talk. Chuck wagon chili. South Texas trail crews brought chili up the Chisholm Trail, and it never left. The cook browned chunks of beef in lard, then stewed them with dried chili peppers, cumin, garlic, and oregano for hours. No tomatoes, no beans, just meat and fire in a thick red sauce. Real trail chili bore no resemblance to what comes out of a can today. The vaqueros, the original cowboys, invented this spiced meat stew and brought it north with the cattle. Trail chili could be dried into bricks and reconstituted with water weeks later, making it one of the most portable meals on the entire drive. Roasted marrow bones. When a steer was slaughtered, nothing went to waste. The cook cracked the leg bones with the back of an axe, set them up right in the coals, and roasted them until the marrow turned soft and buttery inside. Cowboys scooped out the hot marrow with a knife and spread it on biscuits or ate it straight from the bone. Rich, almost overwhelmingly beefy, a smooth, fatty texture that coated the tongue. Bone marrow delivered pure, concentrated calories when every man on the drive was burning thousands more than he consumed. Today, roasted marrow bones cost $15 a plate in Manhattan steakhouses. On the trail, they were the leftovers nobody else wanted. Pan de campo. The trail bread of the vaqueros crossed into cowboy cooking and stayed. A simple flatbread made from flour, lard, salt, baking powder, and water, rolled thick and cooked in a skillet or directly on hot coals. It puffed slightly as it baked, forming a chewy bread with a charred, smoky crust. Pan de campo acknowledged a truth Anglo cowboys were slow to admit. Much of what made the trail kitchen work came directly from Mexican tradition. The vaqueros had been running cattle across this land for 300 years before the first American cowboy ever saddled a horse.